You ever seen a janitor earn a salute, Corporal? The laugh came sharp and easy, cutting through the cavernous hangar like a blade of sound against steel, echoing off the high rafters and the silent skeletons of aircraft parked in perfect lines, and Corporal Ryan Blake leaned back on his heels as he said it, arms crossed, a smirk settling comfortably across his face while the rest of his squad shifted just enough to show they were listening, watching, waiting for whatever came next. The smell of jet fuel hung faint in the air, mixed with the dry grit of concrete dust and the distant hum of a generator somewhere beyond the open bay doors, but none of it seemed to reach the old man standing a few feet away, his back slightly bent, one hand resting on the worn wooden handle of a mop, the other steadying a dinted yellow bucket that reflected the overhead lights in dull, wavering patches. His uniform a simple gray janitor's coverall with creases that spoke more of time than care, his boots scuffed but clean, as if he respected the ground more than the people walking on it. Ethan Cole didn't answer, not right away, his pale blue eyes lifting just enough to meet Blake's without challenge, without submission, just a quiet acknowledgement that seemed to linger longer than it should, like a moment stretched thin across years no one else in that hangar could see, and that silence, that stillness, only seemed to feed the energy building around him as one of the younger Marines chuckled under his breath, then another, until the sound rolled lightly through the group like a passing breeze that didn't quite reach the old man. Blake stepped closer, boots scraping against the concrete with a dry, deliberate sound, and tipped his head slightly, as if studying something amusing, something out of place, his gaze settling on the small piece of metal pinned crookedly to Ethan's chest, a badge that didn't shine like regulation insignia, didn't carry the clean edges or polished authority of rank or unit, just a dull, weathered surface that caught the light in uneven flashes, like it had lived a different kind of life before ending up here. What is that supposed to be? Blake asked, his tone lighter now, almost conversational, but edged with the same easy confidence that came from never having been proven wrong in a moment that mattered, and he reached out without asking, one finger hovering just inches from the badge as if debating whether it was even worth touching. Some kind of souvenir? You get that for mopping fast or something. A few of the Marines laughed louder this time, the sound bouncing off the metal hull of a nearby transport aircraft, but Ethan didn't move, didn't flinch, his hand still resting on the mop, his posture unchanged except for the faintest shift in his shoulders, like a man adjusting to a wind no one else could feel, and for a second, just a second, something in the air seemed to tighten, not enough for anyone to name it, but enough for one Marine at the edge of the group to glance sideways. Uncertain why the moment suddenly felt heavier than the joke deserved, Blake noticed it too, though he misread it, mistook it for attention, for control, and his smirk deepened as he leaned in a fraction closer, lowering his voice just enough to make the next words feel personal, deliberate. You know this is a restricted hangar, right? You don't just wander in here with a bucket and a mystery badge and expect people to take you seriously. And still, Ethan said nothing, his eyes drifting past Blake for a heartbeat, toward the open hangar doors where sunlight spilled in long, golden lines across the concrete floor, catching dust in the air like suspended time, and then back again, calm, unreadable, as if whatever answer Blake was waiting for had already been given somewhere else, long before either of them stood in this place. The silence stretched again, longer now, enough to make the laughter taper off into uneasy grins, enough to make the hum of the generator seem louder, the distant clank of tools sharper, and Blake, unwilling to let the moment slip, reached out just a little closer, his finger finally brushing the edge of the badge, the contact light, almost careless, but the kind of mistake that doesn't announce itself until it's far too late, and somewhere deep in the hangar, unnoticed by all but the stillness itself, something began to shift. The instant Blake's finger made contact, the faint scrape of rubber soles against concrete seemed to fade, replaced by a silence that did not belong to the hangar at all, a silence that pressed in from somewhere deeper, older, and Ethan's hand tightened just slightly on the mop handle, not enough to be seen as resistance, just enough to steady something invisible beneath the surface. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, rough with age but steady in a way that did not invite interruption. You should not touch that. The words simple, almost quiet, but they carried a weight that did not match the man in the gray coveralls. And for a brief moment, Blake hesitated, not because of the warning itself, but because of how it was delivered, like it was not a suggestion, not a request, but a statement shaped by experience no one else in the room could measure. Then the hesitation passed, replaced quickly by the familiar armor of confidence, and Blake let out a short laugh, pulling his hand back as if amused by the reaction. "Relax, it is just a piece of metal," he said, turning slightly to glance at the others, inviting them back into the moment, into the safety of shared amusement, and a few of them nodded, the tension easing just enough for the rhythm of the hangar to creep back in, the distant hum returning, the faint clatter of a tool dropped somewhere far behind them. But something had already shifted, something subtle and difficult to name, and it lingered in the way one of the Marines shifted his weight, in the way another stopped smiling just a second too soon. Blake was not finished. He stepped closer again, circling slightly, as if inspecting Ethan from a different angle, his boots leaving faint scuffs on the dusty floor. "You know, I have seen a lot of badges," he continued, voice casual but probing now. "Unit insignia, qualification pins, commendations, all of it, and I do not recognize that one, not even close." He leaned in just enough to study it again without touching it this time, his brow furrowing in exaggerated curiosity. "So what is it supposed to be? Some kind of custom piece? Or you just picked it up somewhere and decided it looked official enough?" And still Ethan did not react the way Blake expected. No irritation, no attempt to explain, just that same quiet presence, as if the question itself did not deserve an answer spoken out loud. The light from the open hangar doors shifted slightly as a cloud passed overhead, dimming the sharp lines across the floor, softening the edges of everything in sight. And in that muted glow, the badge caught just enough light to reveal its imperfections more clearly. A rough edge here, a shallow dent there, the surface worn in a way that suggested it had not been made for display, but for something else entirely, something functional, something real. Blake noticed it too, though he did not understand it, and that only seemed to irritate him more. The lack of a clear explanation, the absence of a neat category to place it in, and he straightened, exhaling through his nose as if dismissing the entire thing. "Figures," he muttered, loud enough for the others to hear. "Nothing official." And he took a step back, widening the space between them just enough to re-establish control of the moment, or at least the appearance of it. "You should probably stick to the floors, old man. That is what you are here for." The words were not shouted. They did not need to be. They landed flat and confident. The kind of statement that usually ended conversations like this, that usually restored the balance Blake was used to. But this time, the balance did not quite settle the way it should have. And from the edge of the group, a voice spoke up, quieter, more measured. "Corporal." Captain Daniel Brooks stepped forward, his presence cutting through the loose formation without force, just authority carried in posture and tone. His eyes not on Blake at first, but on Ethan, studying him with a focus that was not casual, not dismissive, something closer to recognition without certainty. And when Brooks finally shifted his gaze to the badge, his expression tightened almost imperceptibly, like a detail had surfaced in his mind that did not fit with the rest of the scene. "Where did you get that?" he asked, not mocking, not challenging, just direct. And for the first time since the exchange began, the question hung differently. In the air, not as an accusation, but as something that might actually matter, and Ethan's eyes moved to Brooks, steady, clear, and for a second, the hangar seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for an answer that was no longer just part of a joke. Brooks did not move closer right away. He did not need to. His presence alone shifted the shape of the moment, and the Marines who had been leaning in with casual amusement straightened just enough to acknowledge it, their attention no longer scattered but drawn into a single point between the captain and the old man. And when Ethan finally answered, his voice came the same as before, low and even, but this time there was something else beneath it, something older, something that did not belong to the hangar or the present day. "A long time ago," he said, not offering more, not explaining, just placing the words there like a marker in ground no one else could see. And Brooks held his gaze for a second longer than protocol required, studying the lines in Ethan's face, the way he stood, the way he did not shift under scrutiny, and then his eyes dropped again to the badge, narrowing slightly as if trying to place a memory that refused to fully surface. Blake let out a quiet scoff, breaking the tension before it could deepen. A long time ago is not exactly a regulation answer, sir, he said, emphasizing the last word with just enough edge to remind everyone where he believed the authority still rested. And he stepped forward again, reclaiming space that Brooks had not even tried to take. With all due respect, Captain, this is getting blown way out of proportion. It is just a janitor with a piece of scrap metal pinned to his chest, his tone confident, controlled, the kind that usually ended discussions before they started, and a couple of Marines nodded instinctively, drawn back into the comfort of hierarchy and certainty. Brooks did not respond immediately, his attention still fixed on the badge, and the silence stretched again, but this time it was different, not uncertain, not uneasy, but deliberate, like a pause placed exactly where it needed to be. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than Blake's, but it carried further, cutting clean through the space without force. Where exactly did you get it? He repeated, more precise now, and Ethan's hand shifted slightly, not to hide the badge, not to adjust it, just to rest more firmly against his chest for a fraction of a second, a motion so small it might have gone unnoticed if not for the stillness surrounding it. And when he answered again, the words came just as simple. It was given to me, he said, and for a moment, that was all. But then, almost as an afterthought, he added, by someone who needed to remember. And the hangar seemed to absorb that sentence in a way that did not quite make sense, like it carried more meaning than the words themselves should allow. Blake shook his head, a faint smile returning as he exhaled. Okay, now we are telling stories, he said, turning slightly to the others as if inviting them back into familiar ground. Look, Captain, I get it. Everybody likes a good story, but we have real work to do here. He gestured toward the aircraft line behind them, their silent frames stretching down the length of the hangar. And I am pretty sure none of it involves decoding mystery badges. A few quiet chuckles followed, softer this time, less certain, but enough to give Blake the sense that the moment was slipping back under his control. Brooks finally looked away from the badge and met Blake's eyes, his expression calm, unreadable, but there was a firmness there now that had not been present before. Stand by, Corporal, he said, not raising his voice, not needing to. And the words landed with a clarity that left no room for argument. And Blake's jaw tightened just slightly, the smallest sign of resistance, but training held, and he stepped back half a pace, crossing his arms again, the motion sharper this time, less relaxed. Brooks reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone with a movement that was smooth, practiced, and he turned slightly away from the group, not fully, just enough to create a small boundary. And as his thumb moved across the screen, dialing a number from memory rather than searching for it, the Marines exchanged brief glances, the kind that carried unspoken questions, because whatever this was, it had clearly moved beyond a simple joke, beyond a janitor and a badge, into something none of them could quite define yet. And behind them, the steady hum of the generator continued, unchanged, indifferent, but the space around them had shifted again, tighter now, more focused, like the hangar itself was waiting for whatever came next. And Ethan Cole stood exactly where he had been from the beginning, one hand on the mop, the other resting at his side, his eyes no longer on Blake, no longer on Brooks, but fixed somewhere just beyond the open doors where the light stretched across the concrete, as if he had already seen the next moment before anyone else had even realized it was coming. Brooks turned his back just enough to shield the screen of his phone from the others, his thumb steady as he pressed the call button, and for a moment there was nothing but the faint ringing tone bleeding into the background noise of the hangar, a thin electronic pulse that seemed too small to matter, and yet somehow carried more weight than the laughter that had filled the space just minutes before. And Blake watched him with a tightening jaw, his arms still crossed, but no longer relaxed, his eyes flicking briefly toward Ethan and then back to Brooks as if trying to reassemble the situation into something familiar, something controllable. But the pieces were no longer lining up the way he expected. The call connected with a soft click, and Brooks straightened slightly, his voice dropping into a tone that was both professional and deliberate. Sir, this is Captain Brooks at Hangar 12, he said, each word clear, measured. I need a quick verification on a name. There was a pause. just long enough for the Marines nearby to exchange another glance. And then Brooks continued, his eyes lifting briefly toward Ethan before returning to some fixed point ahead. "Ethan Cole," he said, and the name seemed to settle into the air like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward in ways no one could see yet. On the other end of the line, something shifted, not audibly, not in a way the others could hear. But Brooks felt it in the silence that followed, a silence that was no longer routine, no longer casual, and his posture changed almost imperceptibly, his shoulders tightening, his stance becoming more rigid, more attentive, as if the weight of the conversation had increased without warning. "Yes, sir," Brooks said after a moment, his tone sharper now. "I understand." And he turned slightly, angling his body just enough to look directly at Ethan while still holding the phone to his ear. "He is here, sir." Another pause, longer this time, and the faint hum of the generator seemed to fade again, replaced by that same unnatural quiet that had crept in earlier, pressing in from the edges of the hangar, and Blake shifted his weight, the sole of his boot scraping softly against the concrete, the sound louder than it should have been in the stillness. Brooks listened, his expression tightening not with confusion, but with recognition, as if a missing piece had finally locked into place. And when he spoke again, there was no trace of doubt left in his voice. "Understood, sir. We will hold position," he said, and then, after a brief hesitation that suggested he was choosing his words carefully, he added, "Yes, sir," immediately. The call ended with a soft tap, and Brooks lowered the phone slowly, not rushing, not reacting outwardly, but something in the way he stood now had changed completely, the casual observation replaced by a quiet certainty that carried more authority than any raised voice could have. Blake uncrossed his arms, his confidence beginning to fray at the edges. "Captain," he started, his tone attempting to reclaim control. "With all due respect, what exactly are we doing here?" But Brooks did not answer him right away, his gaze still fixed on Ethan, studying him not as a janitor, not as an interruption, but as something else entirely, something that did not fit within the normal structure of the base. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but it carried a firmness that cut through Blake's question before it could fully land. "We are waiting," he said simply, and the words settled heavier than they should have, because waiting implied something was coming, something that required attention, something that mattered. Blake exhaled slowly, running a hand along the back of his neck, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked between Brooks and Ethan, trying to read what he was missing, trying to find the logic that would restore the balance he was used to. But there was none offered, none explained, and behind them, one of the Marines shifted again, his earlier amusement completely gone. Now, replaced by a quiet unease he could not quite explain, his gaze drifting to the hangar doors where the sunlight had brightened again as the cloud passed, casting long, sharp lines across the floor that seemed to point inward, drawing attention back to the center of the scene. Ethan remained where he had always been, unmoved, his hand resting lightly on the mop handle, his eyes steady and distant at the same time, as if the present moment was only one layer of something much larger, something that stretched far beyond the walls of Hangar 12. And as the seconds ticked by, stretching longer than they should, the entire space seemed to shift once more, the ordinary rhythm of the base fading into the background, replaced by a growing anticipation that no one could name, but everyone could feel. Because whatever Brooks had confirmed on that call, it had changed everything, and now the hangar was no longer just a place of routine and maintenance. It had become a stage waiting for something to arrive. The waiting stretched into something tangible, something that settled over the hangar like a thin layer of dust no one could brush away. And even the smallest sounds began to carry more weight than they should have. The distant hum of the generator turning into a steady pulse, the faint creak of cooling metal echoing from the aircraft frames, and somewhere far off, the low whine of a vehicle engine approaching along the service road, barely noticeable at first, but growing slowly, steadily, until it became impossible to ignore, and Brooks lifted his head just slightly, his eyes shifting toward the open hangar doors without turning his body, as if he already knew what that sound meant. Blake heard it too, his gaze snapping toward the lights spilling across the concrete, his posture tightening again, but this time not from confidence, not from control, but from uncertainty that had begun to settle in his chest, the kind that did not come with answers, only questions, and he glanced back at Brooks, searching for some explanation, some sign that this was still a situation he understood, but Brooks offered none, his attention fixed forward, his stance now unmistakably formal, shoulders squared, feet planted with quiet precision. The vehicle came into view just beyond the hangar threshold, a dark staff car moving slowly, deliberately, its presence alone enough to shift the air in a way no words could. And as it rolled to a stop just outside, the engine idling with a low, controlled hum, every Marine in the vicinity felt it, that subtle but undeniable shift in hierarchy, in importance, in something larger than routine, and without being told, without a command given, the Marines straightened, small adjustments rippling through the group as boots aligned and shoulders squared, instinct taking over where understanding had not yet caught up. Blake swallowed once, barely noticeable, his earlier smirk long gone, replaced by a tight focus as he stepped back half a pace, giving space he did not realize he had been holding, his eyes locked on the vehicle as the rear door opened with a quiet, deliberate motion, and for a brief second, nothing happened. Just the open door, the sunlight catching the polished edge of it, the stillness stretching to its limit, and then a figure stepped out, tall, composed, his uniform crisp, every line precise, every detail exact, and even before his face was fully visible, the weight of his presence settled over the hangar like a command already given. General Marcus Hale did not rush, he did not look around for orientation, he stepped forward with measured confidence, his gaze fixed ahead as if the path had already been cleared long before he arrived, and the sound of his shoes against the concrete was steady, controlled, each step marking a shift that no one in the hangar could ignore. And as he crossed the threshold into the light, the Marines came to full attention, the movement sharp, unified, automatic, the kind that did not require thought, only recognition, and Blake felt it too, his body snapping into position before his mind could fully process why. His chest tightening as he realized the situation had moved far beyond anything he had anticipated. Brooks stood perfectly still, his posture reflecting the gravity of the moment, but his eyes flicked once toward Ethan, just once, as if confirming something that no longer needed confirmation, and Ethan Cole remained exactly where he had been from the beginning, his hand still resting on the mop handle, his stance unchanged, the same quiet presence that had drawn attention before now standing in direct contrast to the authority entering the space. And yet, somehow, neither seemed out of place. The general continued forward, his pace unbroken, his focus unwavering, and as he moved deeper into the hangar, the distance between him and Ethan closed with a quiet inevitability, each step narrowing the gap, not just physically, but in meaning, in recognition, in something that had been set in motion long before this moment, and the entire hangar seemed to hold itself in suspension, every eye fixed on the path between them, every breath measured, every sound subdued, because whatever was about to happen next was no longer a question of curiosity or misunderstanding. It was something final, something that would redefine everything that had just taken place, and Blake, standing rigid among the others, felt it settle in his chest with a clarity he could not ignore. The realization that the moment he had started with a laugh had already moved far beyond him, and there was nothing left to do. Now but watch. General Marcus Hale slowed as he approached the center of the hangar, not out of hesitation, but precision, as if every step carried intention measured long before this moment, and the sharp lines of sunlight across the concrete caught against his uniform, highlighting the insignia on his chest, the quiet authority in every detail. And yet his eyes were not on the Marines standing rigid in formation, not on Brooks who held his posture like a fixed point in the room, but on Ethan Cole, standing, still beside a worn mop and a dented bucket, a figure that by all appearances did not belong in the path of a four-star general. And still, that was exactly where the general walked. The distance between them closed to a few feet, and then Hale stopped, not abruptly, not with force, just a controlled halt that seemed to settle the air itself. And for a brief second, nothing moved, not a shift of weight, not a breath out of place. The entire hangar suspended in a silence so complete it felt deliberate, and Blake, standing among the others, felt it press against his chest, the realization that something irreversible was unfolding right in front of him. Hale's gaze dropped, not to Ethan's face at first, but to the badge pinned to his chest, and the moment his eyes settled on it, something changed, not outwardly, not in a way that would be obvious to anyone who did not know what to look for. But there was a stillness in him that deepened, a recognition that did not need words, and his hand lifted slightly, not to touch, not yet, just hovering in the space between them as if acknowledging the object carried a meaning no one else in the room could fully grasp. Ethan did not move, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, but his eyes shifted to meet the general's, and in that brief exchange, something passed between them that had nothing to do with rank or protocol. Something older, something built in places far removed from polished hangars and structured commands. And Hale's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the faintest sign of emotion crossing a face trained to reveal none. Behind them, the Marines remained locked in position, but the tension had shifted. No longer uncertain, no longer questioning. Now it was something heavier, something closer to understanding that had not yet been spoken aloud, and Blake felt it settle in his chest. The earlier confidence replaced by a growing awareness that he had stepped into something far beyond his reach. Hale lowered his hand slowly, his gaze still fixed on the badge, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled, but it carried across the hangar with absolute clarity. "I was wondering if I would ever see that again," he said, the words simple. But they landed with a weight that rippled through the silence, and a faint shift moved through the formation behind him. Subtle, almost imperceptible, as if the meaning behind that statement had begun to take shape even without full understanding. Ethan's grip on the mop handle loosened slightly, his shoulders settling in a way that suggested not relief, not pride, but recognition returned, and he gave a small nod, the motion restrained, deliberate. "It has been a long time, sir," he replied, his voice steady, unchanged, as if the years between then and now had not altered the core of who he was. Hale exhaled slowly, the breath controlled, but there was something in it that carried more than the moment could contain, and his eyes lifted from the badge to Ethan's face, holding there for a second longer than protocol required, as if confirming something that had never truly been in doubt. And then, without hesitation, without announcement, he took a single step back, creating just enough space, his posture straightening fully, shoulders squared, the movement precise, unmistakable, and in that instant, every Marine in the hangar felt it before it even happened, the shift from recognition to action, from memory to acknowledgement. Blake's breath caught slightly, his eyes fixed on the general, unable to look away, unable to reconcile what he was about to witness with everything he had believed just minutes before. And the silence deepened one final time, stretching to its absolute limit. As General Marcus Hale raised his hand in a slow, deliberate motion, the gesture controlled, exact, and brought it to his brow in a formal salute directed not at a superior officer, not at a decorated display, but at the quiet janitor standing in front of him. And the impact of that single movement struck the hangar with more force than any command could have, freezing every thought, every assumption, every ounce of certainty in place, leaving nothing behind but the undeniable truth of what they were witnessing. The salute did not end the moment. It defined it, freezing it in place with a clarity that no one present could misunderstand. And for a fraction of a second that felt far longer than it should have, no one moved, no one spoke. The entire hangar locked in a silence so complete it seemed to absorb even the hum of the generator. And then, almost as if pulled by an unseen command, Captain Brooks snapped into a salute of his own, sharp and immediate, the motion precise, practiced, and it was the signal the others did not realize they were waiting for, because one by one, in perfect sequence, the Marines followed, hands rising in unison, shoulders squared, eyes forward, until the entire line stood locked in formal respect directed at the one man who, only minutes earlier, had been dismissed as nothing more than background. Blake's hand came up a fraction slower than the others, not from hesitation and training, but from the weight of realization pressing through him, his mind struggling to reconcile the image in front of him with the memory of his own words, his own laughter, and as his fingers reached his brow, the motion felt heavier than it ever had before, like it carried something beyond routine, something that could not be undone. Ethan stood still through it all, his eyes moving slowly across the line of salutes, not with pride, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet acknowledgement that seemed almost reluctant, as if the attention itself was not something he sought. And for a moment, the badge on his chest caught the light again, that dull, worn surface reflecting the overhead glow in uneven flashes, no longer dismissed, no longer questioned, now unmistakably recognized as something that carried meaning far beyond its appearance. General Hale held the salute for a measured second longer, his posture unwavering, and then he lowered his hand with the same controlled precision, the movement deliberate, final, and only then did the others follow, the synchronized drop of arms echoing softly through the hangar like the closing of a chapter no one had expected to witness. The silence that followed was different now, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but heavy with understanding, with the kind of clarity that arrives without explanation and settles deep. And Hale took a single step forward again, closing the space between himself and Ethan, his gaze steady, direct. "You kept it," he said quietly, and there was no need to clarify what he meant, no need to explain the weight behind the words, because it was already there, carried in the tone, in the history that stood between them. Ethan gave a small nod, the motion restrained, his voice low but firm. "It was never mine to lose," he replied, and the simplicity of the answer seemed to land deeper than any elaborate explanation could have, drawing a faint shift through the Marines behind them as the pieces began to align in ways they had not anticipated. Hale's expression softened just slightly, not enough to break the discipline of his bearing, but enough to reveal something beneath it, something human, something tied to a moment long past that had not been forgotten, and he reached out then, not abruptly, not with force, but with a careful, deliberate motion, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the badge, not taking it, not adjusting it, just acknowledging it in a way that carried more respect than any formal gesture alone could convey. Blake watched it all unfold with a stillness he had never felt before, his earlier certainty gone, replaced by a quiet, undeniable understanding that what he had dismissed as ordinary was anything but, and the words he had spoken echoed back in his mind with a clarity that left no room for justification, no room for defense, only the weight of recognition. Around him, the other Marines remained silent, their posture still formal, their eyes forward, but there was a shift in them too, subtle but unmistakable, a recalibration of perception that would not easily be undone, and at the center of it all stood Ethan Cole, still holding the same mop, still beside the same bucket, unchanged in every visible way. And yet, in that moment, there was no one in the hangar who could look at him and see anything less than what he truly was, the quiet presence that had carried its weight all along, waiting not to be revealed, but simply to be recognized. The weight of the moment did not fade. It settled, embedding itself into every corner of the hangar like something permanent. And for a long second after the general's hand fell away from the badge, no one moved, not because they were waiting for an order, but because there was nothing left to act on, nothing left to prove, only something to absorb, and the silence carried a different kind of authority now, not imposed, not commanded, but earned, and it held the entire space in place. "General." Hale's gaze remained on Ethan for a brief moment longer, and then it shifted, not abruptly, but with intention, sweeping across the line of Marines standing at attention, and when his eyes passed over Blake, they did not linger, they did not accuse, but the absence of acknowledgement carried its own weight, a quiet reminder that what had just occurred was not about correction, but clarity. Hale turned slightly, just enough to address the room without raising his voice. "Some things are not written in records," he said, his tone steady, measured, "but that does not make them any less real." The words moved through the hangar without force, settling into the space with a calm certainty that required no reinforcement, and several Marines shifted almost imperceptibly, the meaning landing deeper than instruction ever could. Brooks remained still, his posture unchanged, but his expression had softened, not with ease, but with understanding, as if the final piece of a puzzle had locked into place. And he glanced once more at Ethan, not as a superior assessing a situation, but as a man recognizing something rare, something that did not belong to everyday structure. Ethan, for his part, had not changed, his hand still resting lightly on the mop, his stance steady, his presence quiet, and yet the space around him had transformed completely, no longer overlooked, no longer dismissed, now defined by the recognition that had been given without request. Hale took a small step back, creating distance once more, not to separate, but to restore the balance of the room, and he gave a slight nod, not formal, not ceremonial, but personal, the kind that carried meaning between two people who did not need to explain it, and Ethan returned it just as simply, the motion restrained, the exchange complete without words. The general turned then, his movement smooth, controlled, and began to walk back toward the open hangar doors, his presence receding with the same quiet authority it had arrived with. And as he passed Brooks, there was a brief pause, a subtle exchange of acknowledgement that required no speech. And then he continued forward, the sunlight catching his uniform once more as he stepped out into the open air. The Marines remained at attention until he cleared the threshold, their discipline holding firm even as the intensity of the moment began to ease. And only when the staff car door closed and the engine sound shifted did Brooks lower his stance slightly, not fully at ease, but enough to signal that the moment had passed. Blake's hand dropped last, slower than the others, his posture still rigid, but no longer from discipline alone, his eyes fixed on the space where Ethan stood, and for the first time since the encounter began, there was no attempt to speak, no effort to regain control, only the quiet realization that what he had dismissed had revealed something far greater than he had been prepared to understand. Around him, the other Marines adjusted subtly, the formation loosening, but the atmosphere did not return to what it had been before. Something had shifted too deeply for that, something that would remain long after the hangar returned to its normal rhythm. Ethan looked down briefly at the bucket beside him, then at the stretch of floor still waiting to be cleaned, and with a small, almost unnoticeable exhale, he adjusted his grip on the mop. The motion simple, familiar, and he resumed his work, the soft sound of the mop gliding across the concrete returning to the space. Steady, unremarkable, and yet now, every Marine who heard it understood that it was not the sound of something ordinary, but the quiet continuation of a life that had already carried more than most would ever know, and needed no acknowledgement to remain what it was. The sound of the mop moving across the concrete floor settled into a steady rhythm, soft and consistent, the kind of sound that would have gone unnoticed before, but now it carried something different, something that lingered in the back of every mind still standing in that hangar. And for a long moment, no one spoke, no one moved with purpose, as if the entire unit had been reset in a way they did not yet fully understand. Corporal Ryan Blake remained where he stood, his arms no longer crossed, his posture no longer rigid from command, but held in place by something quieter, something heavier, his eyes fixed on Ethan Cole as the old man worked, each motion deliberate, unhurried, as if nothing of significance had just occurred, as if the presence of a 4-star general in a full formation salute had not interrupted his routine at all. Blake took a slow breath, the air in the hangar feeling different now, less like a place of noise and movement, more like a space that had witnessed something it would not easily forget, and he stepped forward, one pace at a time, the sound of his boots against the concrete softer than before, less certain, until he stopped a few feet away from Ethan, close enough to speak without raising his voice. Ethan did not look up immediately, his focus still on the floor in front of him, guiding the mop in a smooth arc that left a faint sheen behind, the water catching the overhead lights in thin, reflective lines, and Blake hesitated. The words he had used earlier now distant, out of place, replaced by something he was not used to reaching for, something that did not come easily. Sir, Blake said finally, the word unfamiliar on his tongue in this context, but it landed where it needed to, quiet, direct, and Ethan paused then, just slightly, the mop stilling for a fraction of a second before he lifted his gaze, meeting Blake's eyes with the same calm steadiness as before, no judgment, no expectation, just presence. Blake swallowed once, his throat tight, not from fear, but from the weight of recognition, and he nodded, a small, controlled motion. I was out of line, he said, the words simple, unadorned, but they carried more honesty than anything he had spoken since the moment began, and for a second, the hangar seemed to lean into that statement, the quiet around them holding it in place. Ethan studied him briefly, not searching for weakness, not measuring rank, just seeing him as he was. And then he gave a small nod in return, the motion restrained. "You were doing your job," he said, his voice even, the words not dismissive, not forgiving, but balanced, as if placing the moment back into its proper context without diminishing what had happened. Blake exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders, but not all of it, because understanding did not erase what had come before. It only reframed it. And he glanced briefly at the badge, then back at Ethan. "That badge," he said, stopping short of a question, as if unsure whether he had the right to ask, and Ethan followed his gaze for a moment, looking down at the worn piece of metal pinned to his chest, the edges still rough, the surface still marked by time. And then he looked back up, his eyes steady. "It is not for showing," Ethan said quietly. "It is for remembering." And the simplicity of the statement settled into Blake with a clarity that required no further explanation, and he nodded again, slower this time, the meaning landing fully, reshaping something fundamental in the way he saw the man in front of him. Behind them, the other Marines had begun to move again, quietly returning to their tasks. But there was a difference in their movements now, a subtle awareness, a respect that did not need to be spoken aloud. And Brooks watched from a distance, his expression calm, his posture relaxed just enough to signal that the moment had resolved, though its impact would remain. Blake stepped back, giving Ethan space, not out of dismissal, but respect, and for a brief second, he brought his hand up once more, not as part of formation, not as a response to command, but as a personal gesture, a quiet salute offered without audience, without announcement, and Ethan acknowledged it with a slight incline of his head. Nothing more, nothing needed. The rhythm of the hangar returned slowly, the hum of machinery, the distant voices, the ordinary sounds filling the space again. But beneath it all, something had changed, something that would not fade with routine. And as Ethan resumed his work, the mop gliding across the floor with the same steady motion as before, it became clear that nothing about him had needed to change at all, because the truth had been there from the beginning, waiting not to be proven, but simply to be seen. And in the quiet that followed, it settled into the space like a final, unspoken understanding that respect is not demanded, it is recognized, and once it is seen, it is never forgotten.